Some verses to us. John chapter 20, we're starting at verse 24. And would you like to, you've got a page number there?
I think so, 1089, is it?
1089.
Yeah, 1089.
Try 1089 or the index.
Right, John 20, starting at verse 24. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Now move on to chapter 21 and verse 15. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the other disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them was written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Amen.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And maybe you'd like to take your new sheet that looks like this and you'll find the outline for this morning's talk in there. Pick up a pen, and then you can make a few notes or do a doodle or do something else. But please, I think you'll find that quite helpful this morning. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever watched a movie twice or more than once? If you have, turn to your neighbour and tell them which movie it was. Go. Okay, what movies have we got? Somebody shout one out. What movies have we got? Sorry? Way Out West. Day Dies. Which one? A Few Good Men. A Shawshank Redemption. Can I ask you a question? I mean, in our house, the question I'm often asked is, can we watch Mamma Mia again? I always say yes. But why on earth? Because you know what the ending is. You can only ever watch a film for the first time once. Otherwise, the rest of the time it's going to be a spoiling of the plot. I mean, you're no better than the Irish gambling addict who lost 50 quid on the replay. Why on earth watch a film more than once? Actually, according to Professor Nicholas Christenfield, plot spoilers, or watching a film more than once where you know what the ending is, don't actually reduce our enjoyment of the film. According to his research, no one watches a romantic comedy truly wondering whether the couple will actually be happy in the end. Or no one watches a detective story without worrying whether the detective will actually find who done it by the end of the movie. The point really is, we're not watching things for the ending, we're watching them for the journey. So it doesn't matter if you have a plot spoiler. You know you're going to get there in the end. Now, today, we're starting a new series of talks that's going to take us right through till Christmas, and we're going to be looking at the Gospel of John. And I'm going to be starting right at the very end with a plot spoiler. Because John, at the end of his book, tells us why he wrote it. And then if you want, you can go back to the beginning. I do recommend you read it, actually. It doesn't take long. But go back to the beginning with that plot spoiler in mind, and you can read the whole story about Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And you can see time and time and time and time again how every part, every element of the story points towards this one thing that John is telling us about. So John's Gospel this morning, I want you to know there is a spoiler alert, and there is a plot spoiler coming, and Margaret read it to us. Actually, nearly read it to us. There's another verse. Margaret read it to us this morning. When John wrote his gospel, what then was his spoiler? What was the end, the foremost idea that he wanted to get? Well, first of all, and at the most basic level, John's gospel is a history book. He's describing things that he saw firsthand. He was a fly on the wall in Jesus' disciple group. But it's more than a history book. And we like to think of history books as being cool, calm, objective accounts of what happens. They never are. And they never are because the history writer always makes choices about what he or she is going to put in the book. And John is no exception. Every history writer has to select what they're going to put in. And that choice reveals the motives behind writing the book. So when John composed his gospel, he made some carefully considered choices about its content. And actually, he selected 7 signs. We think of them sometimes as miracles, but he called them signs. 7 extraordinary incidents in Jesus' life to show us who Jesus really is. So John's gospel is history with a motive. Yes, it is history, but he wants us to get something out of that history, and that history is described very well for us in our plot spoiler, his conclusion, and you'll find that in John chapter 20 and verse 30. This is what we read there. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's where we're heading. That's the plot spoiler. John wants us to know why he's writing his book. You see, in John's gospel, there is first of all something to believe, that Jesus is the Christ. He really is actually God in a body. And as you read through John's gospel, you can see time and time again that the evidence is pointing in that direction. That's the conclusion he wants us to arrive at. In fact, it's a classic example of what writers often call show, don't tell. Because John could say, right at some point, well, Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Son of God, full stop. Okay, let's move on from there. But he didn't. He told the story. And he leaves us to conclude that Jesus really is God in a body. And he does it so skillfully that when we get to the end, this plot spoiler for us, conclusion for him, is merely the climax, or it's merely a summary of what has happened. Jesus is the Christ. There's something to believe. But also, that verse tells us there's something to receive. And the thing that we're to receive is life in a new dimension. I want you to know that Jesus is the Christ, and that by knowing that, you will have life in his name. That's where John finishes his gospel. It's where we start today, and we're going to go through John's gospel backwards for that reason. And incidentally, we end up with Christmas very nicely. Isn't that lovely? So let's come back to this passage that we're looking at today. John wrote up 7 signs, and in verse 30, he says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded here. Well, if he did other signs, he must have done at least one. There must be one here that John is talking about, and sure enough, there is. We need to go back to this passage at verse 19 in chapter 20 to see what it is. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, let me just fill in the backstory here. Jesus has been arrested. He's been crucified, has been murdered by the Romans, he's been buried by the disciples, very likely, and the tomb has been sealed up, and guards have been put on the tomb, and so on and so forth. So, beginning of the following week, day and a bit later. On the first evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, because the Jewish leaders were now gunning for the disciples in the same way they gunned for Jesus, Jesus came and stood among them. And he said, "Peace be with you." And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. And now, if you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven." So here is the sign John's talking about. Jesus suddenly appears after he's died and confirms who he claims to be. But Thomas wasn't there. And not everyone is comfortable about this. And I want to just alert us to 2 people who were not comfortable. The first one was Thomas the doubter. We all know about doubting, or most of us probably know about doubting Thomas. So just imagine, put yourself in the shoes of those disciples. Suppose you were one of them sitting there, and suddenly Jesus appears in the room. You know, you're holed up because of the Jewish leaders. You've locked the doors. They want to murder us, like they did Jesus. And then all of a sudden, this character turns up as if from nowhere. And the other disciples get all excited over it. Look, this is Jesus. And I can't help feeling I've been a bit like Thomas. And I'd want to take them on one side and say, "Hey guys, look, I don't want to burst your bubble. And with all due respect to whoever you are, but you're not Jesus. You may look like him, you may sound like him, but only a few days ago I buried him. I've seen the corpse. This does not make sense." Now the guest seems curiously unfazed by this and looks straight at me and he says, "Okay, Thomas, you need the evidence. Here it is." And he slowly draws his hand out from under his cloak. and shows them. And I can see the scars in his hand. Thomas, that's not all. Actually, you know, they speared me at my side. He starts pulling out his shirt. And suddenly it clicks with Thomas. This really is Jesus Christ. There's the sign. If Jesus is God in a body, death is not going to be a problem to him. He's the creator of life and death. So it's no wonder that Thomas sinks to his knees and he says, "My Lord and my God." Now just think about it for a moment, because the existence of doubt actually shows that Thomas has faith. It's the same for you and me today. The existence of some of our doubts shows that we're capable of having faith. Because you can't doubt belief A without having faith in belief B. You see, in Thomas's case, he couldn't doubt Jesus is standing here without accepting the belief dead men don't come back from the grave. Do you get the idea? Thomas's model was dead men don't come back from the grave, so what he was seeing appeared to conflict with that. Now, he believes that dead men don't come back from the grave. That's faith, that's belief. He's got evidence for it. But here is something that appears to conflict with that evidence. So the change in Thomas was not from complete skepticism to complete trust in an instant. That would just be unrealistic. The transformation in Thomas was from assuming that Jesus was subject to the dead men don't rise again rule to realizing that he wasn't, that this rule had been broken. Thomas still believed that people don't usually rise from the dead, but he also believed that there was one wonderful exception, and that was Jesus standing right in front of him. That is the sign. That's John's sign to say, look, Jesus really is who he says he is. The rule, people don't rise from the dead, has been broken once and for all. Now, my friend, I don't know where you stand this morning in relation to this. You might be a doubter. You might be looking at some of this stuff, some of this Christian stuff, and saying, I'm really, really not sure about it. That's okay, so long as you don't stay there. Jesus understands doubters. And what he does with doubters is he draws us to the evidence and he says, look at that and believe. And that's what Thomas did. Well, if we've got Thomas, doubt is faith in two minds. You might like to write that down. I didn't use that phrase just now. I had intended to. I put it on the PowerPoint. Now you know the story. Let's look at the other story, shall we? And that's Peter. And I want to call Peter the drifter. Because just before Jesus was killed, he'd had an encounter with Peter. And Peter had said to Jesus, Lord, I'll follow you. I'll follow you to the death. And Jesus says to him, will you? Before the cock crows for tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. And sure enough, Peter denied his Lord 3 times over that night when he was arrested. And that was a salutary moment for Peter. Now, how would Jesus Christ, the risen Jesus, handle a man whose faith had drifted to such an extent that he denied Christ? How would you respond to that? If it was me, I think I'd be tempted to look elsewhere for more favourable material. But I want to alert you to 2 words in the story that, as John writes it up. I want you to alert you to the word agape. That's the Greek word for deep, committed, sacrificial love. A love that goes a second mile, a love that gives a life for the loved one. A love that can't be matched by anything else. That's the love that Christ has for you. And the love that he calls us to extend to others. And then there's a second Greek word, phileo. They're difficult to translate into English, and that's why I'm just drawing your attention to them. Phileo is a lesser kind of love. It's the kind of love that says, I'm okay with you. I like you. That's good. That's cool. And I'm okay with you. Now, in this passage where Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" they're playing with those two words, and it doesn't come out very clearly in English. So if you look at verse 15, if you've got it on your lap, perhaps I can read it to you. When they'd finished eating, verse 15, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" That's agape. "More than these? Are you more devoted to me than these other disciples around you?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord. You know that I'm okay with you." Phileo. So Jesus said, "Feed my lambs. Take pastoral responsibility for the people who are going to follow me." Even though Peter's response was less than 100%. Don't you find that amazing? Again, verse 16, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" Agape. And Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know I'm kind of okay with you." Phileo. And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep. Take pastoral responsibility for people who will come to faith as a result of what you disciples do." And then the third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, are you okay with me?" Phileo. Jesus is not using agape anymore. So you can understand why, verse 17, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him on the third time, "Are you just okay with me?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I'm okay with you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Those two loves. I'm okay with you. I love you deeply and I'm committed to you. I'd like to show you a short video clip. We'll need the sound up from the laptop, actually. Yesterday, Rosie and I had the great thrill of going to a wedding. It was the wedding of our nephew, and he married a girl called Sarah, and Sarah co-directs a samba band. And something that just blew us all away was as she came out of the church at the end of the service, the samba band were waiting for her, and this is what I saw. And so it went on. Now, how long did it go on for? It must have been about 20 minutes, wasn't it? It was really long. But anyway, she was directing this band. And one of the things that came out when they did their speeches later was the transition that took place between her thinking about her husband, her now husband, "I'm okay with you," to thinking, "I love you deeply." And their wedding was a celebration of that deep love. Now, what Jesus is saying here is, do you love me? And do you love me in the sense that you're okay with me? Or will you give your life for me? What is the degree of your love? Peter's faith had drifted. And yes, to be sure, he was a flawed man. He denied his Lord. But even that flawed man is restored by Jesus. And he says, "Peter, feed my sheep." And within a matter of weeks, Peter is forming the new church in Jerusalem. And he is their pastor. He feeds the sheep that God's given him. And that's true of any pastor of a church. He or she needs to feed God's people, to take them to places where they'll find spiritual refreshment and nourishment, even though all of us, pastors and people alike, are flawed. My friend, where do you stand in that this morning? I'm not suggesting you should become a pastor, heaven forbid, only if God drives you into a corner, trust me. But I am asking, do you love me more than these? Because Jesus died for each of us. That's the extent of his love. And it could be this morning that the Lord's brought you into this building to reaffirm that choice. Lord, I love you. I'm committed to you. I want you to be my Lord and my master. I will allow you to be the arbiter in my decision making. I want to be the one who loves you deeply and receives that love in return. That's what Jesus wants for us. And I'm going to suggest that we bow our heads in prayer for a moment.